I just want to thank everyone for coming along and just thank you for the honour of being invited to speak. And I just hope that I have something that people can take away from this that they find interesting. I know we have already done this today, but I really would like to acknowledge the original storytellers who lived here, the Turrbal and Jabra people. They're the traditional custodians of this land on which this event is being held. And I wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, who are the traditional keepers of ancient stories that have been told here for a very long time. It's nice to continue that tradition with our own stories. So telling stories really is a fundamental way that humans share their experiences. And as a GP, I feel it's a real gift that we are privileged to be paid to listen to people's stories. The consulting room is such a place of vulnerability where people come. I mean, we see people nude. It's not very many contexts where we do that. So physically and emotionally, they make themselves very vulnerable to us. And they often tell us things they haven't told anyone else before. I only had somebody this week who I've been seeing for years, a lady in her 80s, and I was seeing for her for something very routine, a repeat of some of her medications, a blood pressure check. She's a grandmother. I see some of her children, a couple of her grandchildren. And just out of the blue, she said that her grandfather had interfered with her as a little child, and then just she moved straight on and then came back and said it's the first time she'd really told anybody that. So they trust us to be the keepers of their secrets because they know we won't tell anybody else. It's then up to us to translate those stories into good clinical care. So the beauty and challenge of general practice is the never-endingness of our patients' stories. So like a good novel, their lives are full of unexpected twists and turns, and they don't necessarily have a satisfying ending. It's the perfect profession for a writer. It's the opportunity to participate in the raw, vulnerable face of humanity. So with the constraints of a time limit, I'm going to share some of my experiences, a bit of a cook's tour through my life as a GP, and I'm going to read out just a few extracts from some of my published pieces. Many of us, you will know Dr Fiona Robertson. She was a colleague that worked with us. I know some of my colleagues from Camp Hill Healthcare are here, but she was a wonderful colleague, and she actually left general practice in order to pursue her writing, immerse herself in that more fully, and then won the Glendower Award, and her book of short stories was published. And at one of her book launches, she was asked the question, does she consider herself a doctor who writes or a writer who is a doctor? And after a little bit of thought, she said the latter, that she's actually a writer who is also a doctor. And I'm still not able to answer that question because I'm quite passionate about both things. And when I'm immersed in my writing, I think I'm definitely a writer. And when I'm at work, I think I'm definitely a GP, collecting stories. However, the love of writing for me came first. I still remember the thrill of having my first piece published. So I was in primary school, and there was a competition. We had to write a story to be included in a time capsule, which was under a wooden plinth in the foyer of the school. And when my story was chosen, I was so excited I couldn't actually stand up to get the thing. And I still get that thrill. Every time something I write is published, I still have that same thrill. The idea of medicine, the seed being planted to do medicine came a little bit later. I was in high school. And in early high school, I became really unwell. In fact, I missed an entire term of school. I had rheumatic fever, which was complicated by Sydenham's chorea. So when I grew up, I had recurrent, quite severe tonsillitis, and I lived in a family that really believed in pushing through things like that. So I used to be dosed up on paracetamol and sent to school. And I still remember one day being at school, dosed up, sore throat, and hallucinating, and my mother was asked to come and pick me up and took us to our local GP, who was an older man who was a solo GP, consulted out of his room. And I still remember feeling really unwell, and he came out and was really angry that he'd been interrupted. He was having his lunch and refused to see us. A little later, sometime later, I ended up in hospital, and then I went in and out of hospital for some months after that. And I remember in hospital being referred to as the child in bed number 3 regularly. I think I was 12 or 13. And I just remember thinking, I think I could do better than that. I think I'd like to try and become a doctor. I had no idea what that meant, no one medical in our family at all. I've got the sort of family that if there's something medical on, there's blood, everyone leaves the room and offers to make coffee and tea. So there was no medical background at all. It was quite challenging for me because I had a very humanitarian focus. I didn't do physics. I wasn't particularly fond of higher level maths. And the family were quite unsupportive. They didn't think much of doctors. The careers advisor told me there's no way I'd ever get in, and basically gave my mother advice to do something else. And she was right, I didn't get in. So I went back and did a mature age matriculation at a TAFE college. In the evenings and during the day, I worked with the Red Cross. Again, very humanities based. I did 2 foreign languages, English literature, which I loved. I did biology. I think that was important, and I did enjoy that. General studies and maths. And then I was accepted into Flinders University, and I told my family in the 11th hour after I'd packed my bag and bought a bus ticket to go to Adelaide. So through my medical career, I worked on weekends and Friday nights to support myself and lived in a series of share houses, and so my writing went on indefinite hold. That's just I just thought I'd put a little selection of my publications up there. I've brought a few of them along, so if anyone's interested in reading a poem or something, they're very welcome, but I will read a couple of little bits out. So my writing was always there. It was like a little itch under the skin. I used to think about it, and I was a prolific keeper of journals, and we have this large trunk of journals that I've kept since primary school, including that long period in hospital in our walk-in robe. But writers were very much beyond how I saw myself. They were this special breed of, I could never imagine really being an author. So it was a bit of a pipe dream that I never really spoke out loud. And then I got busier. So 3 children, working, a husband who went back to do his masters, so I was the sole breadwinner. So really it wasn't very much time for writing. And at one point, when he'd finished his masters, I just felt I really wanted to go back and do that. So I just signed up to do a course, an online writing course with the Sydney Writer Studio, in the week where my family we took our children to see the snow for the first time. And I remember I got up early and I came in at lunchtime while they were all at their ski lessons and skiing, and just obsessively did this course and ended up finishing it several weeks early. And I was so excited by that and enjoyed it so much. So I went on to do further courses with the Queensland Writers Centre, where I'm now a member, and the Australian Writers Centre. And I regularly catch up now with Dr Fiona Robertson, who I showed a little earlier, and we talk all things writing, and she's been a fabulous mentor and tells me which competitions to enter and how to do things. And we all need mentors. I know we all need mentors too in medicine. And then life often gives us and takes away at the same time. So in 2018, we were up on Great Keppel Island with an exchange student from Germany. My daughter was learning German at school, and I got a call from the emergency department at the Canberra hospital where I'd worked years ago, and somebody still remembered me, and told me that my parents had been involved in a terrible head-on collision and that they'd been helicoptered to the hospital, and could I get down there. So it took us over 24 hours by the time we got off the island, and then just overnight, then drove down to Brisbane, and then I managed to get a flight there. And over the next few months, they spent a very prolonged period in ICU and then in rehabilitation. So I was flying backwards and forth between work and helping to sort things out with my parents. But as most of us know, when somebody's in ICU, there are long blank periods. So I spent a lot of time in that little annex, and it gave me the opportunity to write my first novel. So I completed the first draft of my novel sitting in that little annex in ICU. I then did a course with journalist Christine Jackman at the Queensland Writers Centre about writing non-fiction and working freelance. And following that, I wrote a piece, I sent it away, and an hour later it was accepted by a magazine. Again, I was really excited. Kept checking the email to make sure it was really there. After that, I started sending short stories off that Fiona had told me which things to send to, and my short stories started to list in competitions, and I wrote a second novel. I was really thrilled when my pieces started to list, and I do draw shamelessly from my experiences as a GP. I never take people's stories, but they often give you some little snippet, and you think, I'm going to put that into a novel or into a story. And my husband actually bought me a sticker that said, "Be careful, you may be the villain in my next novel." He's very sensitive when I write about men who are not very nice in my books. So my non-fiction has been published in Medicine Today, and this month's, the May edition, has a little story about the home visit, which I'm sure the GPs here will relate to. Also the Big Issue and Mind Food. And I really enjoy making complex issues accessible to the public. And it's an important skill to have, and I sometimes know I'm telling patients enthusiastically about their results, and you get this blank look, and I think I've just used the word epithelium, they don't know what I'm talking about. So writing this sort of thing is a really good way to bring it all back down to earth. However, my great love is fiction. I've had several short stories published in anthologies, and I had another novel that long-listed. It was called A World of Silence in an unpublished manuscript award as well. So when I graduated from medical school at Flinders, I decided to go somewhere small. So I went to Northwest Regional Hospital in Burnie in Tasmania, partly because I hadn't really been to Tasmania before and I wanted the experience of being in a smaller place. This is Wynyard Airport, which is known as being one of the few airports in the world that shares its runway with a railway track. And that railway track used to be used to haul timber from the west coast of Tasmania. And it was the only flat bit of land there, so they had to build the aerodrome, went there, and they built it in the 1930s. I was picked up by the superintendent, and I was one of 4 interns, so we're quite a small clique. We rotated through general medicine, surgery, the emergency department, and paediatrics. My first rotation was the emergency department. It was 10 days on, 2 days off, 10 nights on, 2 nights off. And I hadn't really done many intubations at that time, and I was quite anxious that you were on your own in the emergency department with a nurse, with people on call that you could call in if you needed help. And I think these small regional hospitals, they tend to be fairly quiet overnight, and the nights are very long. However, I asked if I could do some anaesthetic lifts because I really wanted to feel more confident at intubating somebody should that need arise. My first intubation came during my first 10-night rotation. It was my first death, very early in my medical career, and I've never forgotten it. I don't know if any of us ever forget our first death. And years later, I wrote a piece that shortlisted in the Women on Writing, it's a USA essay competition. The piece is called Immortality. So this is the longest, I'll read this one out, and the others are a little shorter. I still remember my first death. I was a newly minted, inexperienced doctor with reckless confidence in the ability of cutting-edge medical care to preserve life. Death, or more to the point dying, was always shrouded with hope by offering the reassuring possibility of one more life-prolonging intervention. I was an intern at a small rural hospital and for the first time had to make my own decisions with no comforting hierarchy of hovering and more senior doctors to cocoon me from the consequences. My survival depended on protocols, intuition, and instinct. That fateful night was the first of 10 shifts in a row, with me the only doctor in this tiny emergency department rostered on with an experienced older nurse, Lynn. My shift started at 10. I arrived straight after dinner with friends, wearing a stylish woolen dress bought with my first pay packet and totally unsuitable for a shift in the emergency department. The phone call came just before midnight. Distraught parents whose son had attempted suicide by hanging. They arrived 15 minutes later. Simon was brought in, not breathing. My heart raced while my brain caught up. I floundered inside the wilderness of uncertainty and disbelief. Emotion bubbled to the surface, clouding those protocols I could recite in my sleep. Simon was my age, his body robust and healthy, undamaged by the ravages of age or disease. My head took over. I plunged from being into doing and activated code blue. Adrenaline surging, I secured the airway while Lynn cut off his shirt and hooked him up to monitors. My first live resuscitation. He was the youngest of 4 boys, had just completed a science degree with honours. Lynn got IV access. A nurse inflated his lungs between my chest compressions while the defibrillator was activated. I sweated into wool. After we shocked him, the monitor came alive with a heartbeat. Reinforcements arrived and I was relieved of my post. Simon was moved to a high dependency bed, his family huddled in a tiny annex, clutching paper cups of international roast. I learnt that our efforts resulted in brainstem function only. Simon's higher centres deprived of oxygen too long. It was impossible to believe that the young man lying peaceful with monitors tracing his heartbeat and respirations would never regain consciousness. I was asked to speak to the family about organ donation. It was early morning, still dark, his parents wide-eyed and hopeful. I blundered into their grief, the bearer of devastating news. I cried, they hugged me, we held each other up. Upstairs, Simon appeared to be sleeping, his skin pink and perfused. His heart pumped. Oxygen was distributed to those vital, life-giving organs inside a young man no longer with us. I discovered that wide, grey, inexplicable twilight zone between life and death. How much brain is lost before the vital force making us human is gone, before our irises float empty in their orbits? The organ donation team was flown in and an operating theatre set up, a macabre surgery that laid Simon to rest, a second departure. Back then there was no debrief, just business as usual. Lynn, long since retired, keeps in touch. I lost him, I confessed, the horror of my inexperience still vivid. She shrugged. He was already lost when he arrived. I still imagine his heart beating, his kidneys filtering blood, his lungs rising and falling, his essence making life possible for others. Was he lost, or does Simon live on? His brief time extended, with his cells revitalised, renewed and immortalised. I'll never know. So after I finished my internship, it was an easy choice. I knew I wanted to be a GP, and I decided to choose the rural stream and ended up on the Fleurieu Peninsula, which is fairly close to Adelaide, about an hour from Adelaide. Took me to a range of places doing the rural stream, the Fleurieu Peninsula, the McLaren Vale area, Wollonga, Aldinga, Mount Gambier near the Coonawarra. It is purely coincidental that all these areas are close to Australia's beautiful wineries, but I did get to go to some nice drug dinners with some very nice wine. Maslin's Beach is a 3-kilometre lovely long beach very close to where I lived, and it's known for the last little section of it is known as Australia's first official nudist beach. I bought my first little place in Aldinga. My supervisor, very nice, very supportive man. I was on call once a week, so you had to start a pager then. So I used to work Wednesdays and you stayed till 9. You got a little half-hour break to have some dinner, and then you did the on-call till the next morning, then you just worked again. And then we did, we took turns doing the weekends on call as well. I really enjoyed the area, but I left for personal reasons. A relationship of 5 years broke down and the relationship became adversarial. When I left, he started stalking me and would sit in the waiting room when I worked on the evenings on my own with a young female receptionist. I was advised by the practice that unless I did something about him stalking the surgery, I couldn't stay because it was too unsettling for staff. I no longer felt safe living in an isolated area, so I sold my place and left. I think this sparked my interest, unconsciously perhaps, in intimate partner abuse. There was no physical abuse, no alcohol, just this pervasive sense of unease, a sense of being isolated from friends, of giving up agency bit by bit. I think we'd probably recognise that now as coercive control. I've written several essays and stories about just this issue. One has been published in Mindfood, and I think there's one on the Queensland Medical Women's Society website. I've also written a fictional story, a short story, Deadly Alliance, on the same theme, which is published in one of the anthologies I showed there. My novel, A World of Silence, explores the unspoken code of silence around gendered abuse. Women who become open about this, as we have recently seen, experience intense public scrutiny. So many of them prefer to stay silent. So I explored this theme using three fictional women, drawing from my experience as a GP to give my characters authenticity. So I left South Australia, sadly, and I moved to Canberra, and we lived just behind the War Memorial, which is what you see right in the front there. And that was more or less my view when I walked up Mount Ainslie from my place. So I did my diploma of obstetrics and gynaecology there, a little bit of work in the emergency department, and I also worked in general practice and did an afternoon in drugs and alcohol. I met my now husband, definitely a keeper. I'd been engaged 3 times by then, so I can say that with some authority. I was still quite keen on following the rural stream, so I managed to convince my husband that we should do the escape to the country dream. And so we ended up in northern New South Wales in Wollongbar. And this is our house. It was actually nice. It was very close to the hospital, which was quite convenient because I had admitting rights at the local hospital. I was on a roster for neonatal resuscitation, which I hadn't anticipated doing. I had to do an intensive course down at the Gold Coast. It's always terrifying, doesn't it? I don't think I would like to do that again. I was also on a roster for the emergency department, so the GPs there cover the hospital and get called in, so there'd be overnights or weekends that we shared. Because I was the only woman doing on-call in Moolumbar, I volunteered to do the forensic examinations of women who'd been sexually assaulted. So I carried that pager with me all the time. In 2.5 years, there were 6 women, but not one of them pressed charges. I think we all know the stats, so I'm just going to repeat them again because I think it's just a good thing to have reinforced. That 1 in 6 women have experienced some form of abuse. 1 in 4 have experienced some form of coercive control. And every 9 days in Australia, a woman dies at the hands of her intimate partner. I think the important thing to remember is that perpetrators are generally charming, and we are taught to be compliant and cooperative and pleasant. You don't want to rock the boat. I see a number of women who are in, I think we all would see a number of women, 1 in 4 women who experience coercive control, but it can be quite difficult to pick. And I know that I'm only seeing the tip of the iceberg. There's one woman I've been seeing for a number of years. She's a really lovely woman. I actually met her partner, who again was quite a charming man, and she was living in the most horrific relationship and eventually left. And I wrote this poem, which was published in the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland Scope magazine. It's called Possession. She wore a high dress, elbows flexed, sleeves like fluttery wings, poised for flight, ready to lift her to freedom. He leads her, opens doors, lured by her trust and uncomplicated smile, intoxicated by her willingness to give. He whispers inducements, one hand possessive on her back. His mouth presses hard on hers, pushes her into the creak of the bed, a glimpse of soft skin, urgent fingers, breath on breasts. His now. He promises, pressures, possesses, knows she will stay, sacrifice small freedoms to secure his commitment. Like light shadows in doorways, she remains out of reach. Curves to a comma, cringes away from him, her quiet too quiet, his rage a simmering fear below the surface. Tightly coiled, he holds her in the palm of his hand, closes his fist around his vulnerability and shame, fuels her fluttering anxiety, his need, until she submits. I really enjoyed Moolumbar. It's really some beautiful beaches, Kingscliff and Cabarito. We had some good friends, but I was always on call for something. You could never just have a glass of wine or relax. When I see them advertising for GPs in some of these smaller rural towns, I think there needs to be some way to resolve that issue of constantly being on high alert. It can't be good for you, constant cortisol driven. I had my first baby when I was there in the hospital where I was admitting people. And I remember 3 of my male colleagues came to visit me the morning after I had her. So it was less than 12 hours later, and I was in my pyjamas. I felt exhausted. My breasts were sore. And one of them had become a father for the 4th time 2 weeks earlier. And he said, "When am I going to get back onto the on-call roster?" He's back on the on-call roster, and he had a baby 2 weeks ago. And I've thought of a lot of really good responses to that since then. But at the time, I was actually just trying to hold it together, and I didn't say anything. 18 months later, 34 weeks pregnant with my second baby, when my husband was offered a job in Brisbane he couldn't refuse, I was actually really relieved. We moved on to Brisbane, and we had our second and third children there, and it was a relief to disappear into the anonymity of the city and to start work at Camp Hill. I was only on call some Saturday afternoons till 4 o'clock. It was luxury. And that was quite infrequent because there's a lot of us there. But I still felt this urge. I felt I really should use this experience that I'd gained and to contribute a little bit. So I signed up to do some remote locums and went up to the York Peninsula to Weipa. So I did that in the school holidays with the children, and they loved it. And they'd give you a beast of a car that I didn't enjoy driving very much. And you can only really, it's completely inaccessible in the wet season. You fly there and everything comes there on a barge. And there's these 2 even more remote Indigenous clinics at Napranum and Mapoon where you go out and you do the chronic health clinics. And they were excellent. I really enjoyed them. I could give emergency a miss. You're on call 1 in 2 and 1 in 2 weekends, so that was pretty full. What's good about this Weipa experience for me was my husband, that's when blogs started becoming a thing, and my husband set one up, and that's when I really started writing. I wrote about all my experiences there. I looked at it, I made some terrible spelling mistakes. I hadn't done anything then. But I looked back over it, and it was a good way to let the writer in me make sense of the whole thing. Having gotten a taste for adventure, when our children were all at school and out of nappies, we decided to go to Ireland for a year. My husband had planned to study, but he ended up being a home dad, and if you haven't done that, I recommend it to everyone. It was a really good experience for him and for me. So I worked casual shifts in a private emergency department, and we regularly disappeared and took our kids to Europe and around the UK and around Ireland. Again, we set up a blog during this time, and this is the first time I did a longer piece of writing. So we wrote that blog most days, and then I wrote a travel memoir of our experience there. It's really only for my family. It's not something I'm planning to publish, but it was a very good. It was a very good way to actually sit down and know that I had the discipline. I could actually do that. I enjoyed it enough that I wanted to keep doing it. We'd been there just over a year, and at the end I stopped work and we just travelled for about 6 weeks, living out of a suitcase with 3 children. I don't know if I would recommend that. It's fun to talk about it afterwards. And one evening it was bucketing rain. We were in Belfast, and we just spent the day at this Who, What, When, Where, Why museum, which was excellent. And my son, who was 5 at the time, said, "Mummy, do we have a home?" And at that point I felt it was time to settle down. So we came back to Brisbane, and that really was coming home for me. Had good friends there now, a lovely practice where I worked. I was part of 2 writers' groups, a member of the Queensland Writers' Centre where I regularly do courses, and I can't really imagine leaving Brisbane now. We also have a lovely group of colleagues, 2 of whom have come here tonight, which is really lovely. A very supportive place to work. And that was never more obvious than during the pandemic. I don't know whether I should mention it, but it's been such a big part of our lives over the last 3 years, and is still ongoing, that I thought I would mention it. I think most of you know here that during that time a lot of patients came with their stories, and I collected a lot of stories and things, not just through work, but out in the community as well, about people's experiences of that first lockdown. That was compiled into an anthology. And a lot of people here contributed to that, including our photographer and Ira and Lydia, and that is going to be part of an exhibition at the Queensland Museum at some point. So even though it was a stressful time, what was good about Camp Hill is we had this car park clinic, so we'd volunteer, one of us would dress in the full PP, and anyone with fevers or coughs, we'd just see them down there. But the good thing about that was that it kept the upstairs clean, so we just had to wear a mask so we could continue to see our patients for their routine care. I'm sure I speak for a lot of you and us, so I've probably seen enough nostrils to last me a lifetime. But nonetheless, I continued to see our elderly and palliative patients at home, to do home visits. And I think this period of time gave us all a lot of things to reflect about. So I wrote this piece for the big issue, and I'm only going to read a couple of little extracts from it. It's called A Touch of Humanity. On Monday, I go on one of my regular home visits to a woman in her 50s. She's palliative now and too anxious to attend appointments at the surgery. Her anxiety in this pandemic era is well placed. She's all jutting bones, hollow cavities and tissue paper skin. She needs more pain medications. It is something I could arrange over the phone, but she wants to see me. We sit side by side on the front veranda. The light and shade dapple through the leaves. The hum of traffic is soft in the distance. A magpie warbles noisy on the fence. I measure her blood pressure, even though the numbers are unimportant now. It gives me a reason to touch her. She has in the past been aloof, reserved. I keep my hand on hers and her pulse rate slows. She was never one for conversation, but now that her time is measured and finite, she wants to share, so I stay longer and listen. An hour passes. I glimpse the cigarettes hidden under the cushion and want to reassure her that it is okay, but I just pretend I don't see them. I realise I've not let go of her hand and give it a squeeze. She never married, has no children. She asks when I will come again. One impact of the pandemic was a drop in human connectedness, not the screen interactions that flourished with social distancing, but real skin-to-skin contact, hugs, a held hand, the sharing of physical touch to communicate love and reassurance. While I supported the measures to use to spread the limit the spread of the virus, this separation from others has lasting impacts on mental health, physical well-being, and even immune function. On one memorable day, I saw one of my regulars, a woman who lives alone and struggles with a long history of severe anxiety and depression. After a long absence, she presented, head bowed. She whispered, "I know it's not allowed, but can I give you a hug?" She held on to me so long, I thought she might never let go. I was the first person she had touched in 7 months. With her permission, I contacted some of her friends and family to ensure she had regular contact with another human being. Touch is fundamental to our humanity. There is a reason that the photograph of 85-year-old Rosa being hugged for the first time in 5 months won Photograph of the Year. That evocative embrace responds to our inbuilt desire for inclusion, love, empathy and reassurance, particularly while in the grip of a pandemic. The following Monday, I ring my palliative lady, give her an opportunity to hide her cigarettes. I settle beside her, check her pulse, keep my hand on hers, determined her final weeks will not be spent untouched and alone. So last year at Camp Hill, we celebrated, sort of towards the end of this pandemic, we celebrated 75 years of medical practice in the area, and my writing group, the Brisbane Scribes, were invited to produce an anthology to celebrate. This was launched in September 2022 at Customs House and contains a history of the area, a brief glimpse of general practice in Brisbane, as well as lots of stories from staff, patients and locals. As ever though, it is the patients who are central to a general practice. And I'm just going to finish with a brief story that actually is in the anthology. It's about one of my patients. And I am fond of my patients, but some of them are definitely harder to like than others. It's called Is It Serious, Doctor? I still remember the days one of our longest employed receptionists, Jan, was at the front desk. Somehow, between 10 and 11 every morning, you would hear a welcoming tap at the door and she would bring you a cuppa and a biscuit. And yes, she knew just how everyone liked their drinks. So I always had a strong tea with a decent slosh of milk, no sugar. She also made a point of knowing which biscuits everyone enjoyed. My favourites were Monte Carlos and shortbread creams. One morning, one of my regular elderly ladies, Mrs. V, came in. I settled in for a long chat, devising an exit plan at the beginning, otherwise she would be there for an hour or so. I really hoped Jan would bring me my cuppa while I was regaled with details about Mrs. V's bowels, the frequency, colour, consistency, how long each one took to pass. Yes, every detail. She wrote down every movement since her last visit in a small spiralled notebook. Today she seemed distressed, clutched her belly. I haven't had a really good movement for 2 weeks, Doc. Is it serious? We still had a cupboard stocked with goodies from the drug rep in those days. I asked her to wait a moment and went in search of laxatives, wondering whether I should give her the spiel about drinking fluids and eating more fruit. When I came back, she was sitting back enjoying my cup of tea. My biscuits reduced to crumbs on the plate. Mrs. V was all smiles, the woes for bowels all but forgotten. Thanks, Doc. This is such a wonderful surgery. I really needed that. Satisfied, she stood up, brushed the crumbs onto the floor and launched herself onto the walker, leaving me with several samples and an empty cup. I wondered whether I could charge her for a long consultation. Thank you very much for your attention.